So this is the new MacBook Neo and I've been using it for about a week now. And I'll be honest, when Apple introduced this thing, I was kind of skeptical just because this laptop starts at $799 Canadian, which makes it the cheapest laptop Apple has ever released. Whenever a company suddenly drops the price, that usually means something important had to be sacrificed. Maybe the performance isn't great, maybe the display is bad, maybe the build quality feels cheap. So the real question I had going into this thing was pretty simple. Does the MacBook Neo actually feel like a proper MacBook? Or does it feel like Apple cut too many corners to hit this price point? And after using it every day for a week, I have a pretty clear answer. Some things here are genuinely impressive, some compromises are pretty obvious, but overall the experience is more interesting than I expected. Let's start with performance, because this laptop is doing something Apple has never done before. Instead of using an M series chip, the MacBook Neo runs on an A18 Pro, which is the same processor family used in Apple's latest iPhones. At first, that sounds strange for a laptop, but once you start using it, the logic actually makes sense. For everyday work, the system feels quick. Opening apps on this thing is instant, switching between tasks feels very smooth, and browsing the web with a lot of tabs open at once isn't a problem at all. Things like writing documents, messaging, watching videos, editing photos casually, or running productivity apps all the time feels completely normal. Where the limits show up is when workloads stay heavy for long periods of time. Large exports, sustained rendering, or very demanding multitasking will push this chip harder than something like a MacBook Air. But realistically, those aren't the tasks most people buying an entry-level MacBook are doing every day. For the type of work this laptop is meant for, the performance is surprisingly capable. Another thing I noticed is how consistent it feels when you're just doing normal tasks. There aren't random slowdowns or weird hiccups, which is something cheaper laptops sometimes struggle with. The 60 gigs per second memory bandwidth helps here a lot because data moves quickly between the CPU, GPU, and apps. Even things like scrolling through heavy websites or switching between multiple tabs feel stable and predictable. The memory situation is where Apple clearly made a strategic decision. The MacBook Neo comes with 8 GB of unified memory, and that's it. There's no upgrade option and you can't change it later. During normal use, the system manages this pretty well. macOS is generally good at allocating memory efficiently. So running browsers, documents, messaging apps, and all the background tasks at the same time still feel very responsive. But if you start pushing things further, the limitations become visible. Switching between heavier apps can sometimes reload them. Older browser tabs may refresh, and if you try to run multiple demanding programs at once, the system begins prioritizing which ones stay active. It's not unusable, but it's clearly designed for typical productivity workloads, not power users trying to run complex environments. Something else worth mentioning is how macOS tries to hide these limitations from you. The system will compress memory or offload things in the background so everything keeps running smoothly. You don't really see what's happening, but you feel it when apps reload. For light users, this won't matter as much, but if you're constantly jumping between tasks, you'll start noticing it more over time. The display is actually one of the nicest surprises here. Apple used a 13-inch liquid retina panel, which is sharp and bright enough for day-to-day use. The text looks clean, images look detailed, and the overall clarity is exactly what you'd expect from a MacBook. The brightness reaches around 500 nits, so it stays readable even in well-lit rooms. Apple simplified things a lot here with the extra display technologies because high-end MacBooks include features like advanced color spaces and automatic color temperature adjustments. Those aren't present here, but in practical terms, that mostly matters for photographers, videographers, or people doing color-sensitive work. For writing, browsing, and watching videos or general productivity stuff, this screen will still look excellent. Another small thing is viewing angles and overall comfort. Even when you tilt the screen or move around, the display stays consistent without any major color shifts. The support for a wide range of colors helps with smoother visuals even if it's not a pro-level panel. For long sessions like studying or watching content, it's easy on the eyes and doesn't feel cheap at all. One thing that surprised me immediately about this was build quality. This laptop doesn't feel cheap at all. So for this, Apple used a full aluminum chassis, the same type of construction you see on their more expensive models like the MacBook Air or the MacBook Pro. That means the body feels rigid, solid, and premium. It weighs just over 1.2 kilograms, so it's extremely easy to carry around. This is exactly the kind of laptop you can throw into a backpack and take anywhere without thinking about it. Apple also released it in several color options, which kind of gives the machine a bit of personality compared to all the usual silver or grey laptops that you can see everywhere. For a device at this price, the physical design is genuinely impressive. It also doesn't really flex much when you pick it up from one side, which is something you see on a lot of cheaper laptops. The hinge on this feels pretty solid too, so opening and closing the lid feels smooth and controlled. Even the small details like the finish and edges make it feel much more expensive than it actually is, which kinda adds up to that overall premium feel when using it daily. The keyboard experience is pretty familiar if you've ever used a MacBook before. Apple did include the Magic Keyboard mechanism, which means the keys still feel consistent and comfortable when typing. The travel is short but precise, which makes long writing sessions pretty easy. The trackpad is slightly different from the one on higher-end MacBooks. Instead of Apple's haptic system, this one uses the traditional mechanical click. The click feels physical and tactile. The only long-term question is durability, since mechanical components can wear differently over time. But throughout the week I've been using it for, the trackpad feels pretty solid and responsive. Another thing I noticed is how quiet the keyboard is. Even when you're typing fast, it doesn't make a lot of noise, which is great if you're in a classroom or library. The trackpad also tracks very accurately even with small movements, so the gestures feel very precise. It just also feels very natural to use this, especially if you're already familiar with macOS. Battery life is another area where the A-series chip helps a lot. The MacBook Neo is rated up to 16 hours of video playback, which sounds impressive on paper. Real-world usage obviously varies depending on what you're doing. For the typical productivity stuff, browsing, messaging, writing, and watching videos, the laptop comfortably lasts through most of a full day. During my week of use, I was averaging somewhere between 7 and 8 hours of active use. That's also with the brightness at around 70 to 80% and a mix of apps running. Once you start pushing the system harder, the battery drain obviously increases more quickly. But for normal everyday workloads, battery life here is very solid. Charging is also pretty straightforward. It comes with a 20-watt USB-C adapter, which isn't the fastest, but it's enough to top it up over time, especially if you're not using or pushing the laptop so hard. Since both the USB-C ports support charging, you can plug it into any of the two ports, which is convenient depending on your setup. The port selection is simple but functional. The MacBook Neo includes two USB-C ports and a headphone jack. That's enough for charging, connecting accessories, or attaching an external monitor. The laptop supports one external display up to 4K, which is fine for a typical desk setup. The wireless connectivity on this is handled through Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 6, so connections to networks and accessories stay fast and stable. This is not a machine designed for complex multi-device setups, but for normal use, the connectivity covers everything most people need. Another small detail is that you don't really need the adapters unless you're using a lot of accessories. For most people, it's just charging, maybe headphones, and occasionally a monitor. And since everything is moving towards USB-C anyway, it feels pretty future-proof for basic use without needing to carry extra dongles all the time. So, who's this laptop for? After using this MacBook for over a week, it's pretty clear who Apple designed this for. This laptop is aimed at students, everyday users, and people entering a Mac ecosystem for the first time. Tasks like browsing, writing, video calls, streaming, and general productivity are exactly what it handles the best. It's also appealing for people who might otherwise consider buying an iPad but still want a full desktop operating system. Because even though this laptop is cheaper than most tablets, it still runs macOS, which means full applications, development tools, and traditional workflows are all available. It's also a really good option for people who just want something simple that works without needing to think about it too much. There's also no real learning curve if you're already familiar with Apple devices, which makes it easy to recommend to a wide range of users. So after a week of daily use, the MacBook Neo ended up being more capable than I expected. Yes, there are compromises, the memory is limited, the chip isn't designed for heavy professional workloads, and some higher-end features from other MacBooks aren't included. But The fundamentals, build quality, display, clarity, battery life, and everyday performance are all genuinely good. And for the price, it delivers something that hasn't really existed before. A MacBook that feels like a real MacBook, but at a much more accessible entry point. And that alone could make it one of the most widely used Macs Apple has ever released.